Welcome to this brief introduction to infant mental health. My name is Marit Appledoorn, and I'm a clinical social worker and an instructor in infant mental health at the Center for Early Education and Development at the University of Minnesota. Before we get started, be sure that you have a pen or a pencil and paper handy, as we are going to do a few written reflections as we work through the presentation together today. So let's go over what we're going to be covering. The first question, of course, is what is infant mental health? It's a term that's come to a lot more prominence lately in the community, and I think has come to mean different things to different people, and certainly different people have different understandings of it. So we want to start by creating a shared definition. Part of that will be a more thorough explanation of why infant mental health is important. And lastly, as a child welfare worker, what are some of the main principles and services of infant mental health that you might consider incorporating into your work, or which you find that you already do? Let's start with our first written reflection. What is infant mental health? What have been, professionally or personally, some of your experiences, opinions, impressions, judgments, thoughts, questions, or anything else regarding infant mental health? Take about 5 minutes and brainstorm anything that you can think of. Now that you've had a chance to reflect, let's weave some of your experience together with a more formal definition of infant mental health. Sometimes when you're defining something, it's easier to start by talking about what it is not. Infant mental health is not a therapeutic technique. It's not something that is part of regular psychotherapy and practiced only by licensed mental health professionals. Actually, there's a whole range of professions which practice infant mental health, including speech therapists, OTs, early interventionists, home visitors, special education teachers, public health nurses, and child welfare workers, just to name a few. What infant mental health is a lens. It's a way of thinking and a way of being in a relationship with highly stressed and at-risk families. And although each of the professions that I mentioned before has its own expertise, one of the lovely things about infant mental health is that it transcends the boundaries between these professions, and it actually helps us to learn from each other's knowledge. A more formal definition of infant mental health is that it, and I quote, focuses on the social and emotional well-being of infants and their caregivers and the various contexts within which caregiving takes place. Infant mental health, therefore, focuses on relationships. Infant development is conceptualized as always embedded within emergent, active systems of relationships. By definition, the infant is born into a social world. Another definition is that infant mental health is rooted in the understanding that developmental outcomes emerge from infant characteristics, caregiver-infant relationships, and the environmental context within which infant-parent relationships take place. So taking those definitions in your own experience, we would think about infant mental health as being a matrix, which means that it consists of each of these three categories and also how these categories interplay and influence each other. The first category would be constitutional factors. This is a biological category. Things that exist within the baby. The baby is born into a body, and that body has both strengths and vulnerabilities. I think we have all met babies who are just inherently more physically hardy. They can stand up to the stress of their lives with just a little bit more strength than some of their peers. Babies also have more mellow, more laid back, more intense, or more active temperaments. Unfortunately, babies are also sometimes born into bodies with genetic issues, medical diagnoses, and even sensory thresholds, which might make them very easy or hard to soothe. In addition to being born into a body, babies are born into an environment. And those environments exist within a huge range. Some environments are very strong neighborhoods, strong communities, and within the community I would also include extended family and friend networks of support that the family has. and also socioeconomic class, geographic location, and other factors which are going to lead to that family being able to access early and high-quality services. Unfortunately, this is not always the case, and families can also be struggling on an environmental level with poverty. They can be part of a marginalized or oppressed social group. There can be family violence, and even the environment itself can have pollution. Most importantly, in addition to being born into a body and into environment, the baby is born into a web of relationships. As with bodies and environments, relationships come with a whole range of stresses and strengths. Caregivers can be more or less attuned. They can have their own personality strengths. They can have their own weaknesses. Relationships can be strong. They can be close. They can be distant. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about attachment. It's time for our next writing reflection. Take 5 minutes to think about some of these factors, constitutional, environmental, and relationship, and write down actual examples from your professional experience, and I would also add from your personal experience of each of them. So why do we spend so much time and emphasis talking about relationships? We do that because we are inherently social beings as humans, and because of that, we have evolved to be wired to develop using relationships. In other words, early relationships are the engine that drive development, and development simply cannot occur or cannot occur well without good relationships.
So how do researchers learn about the quality of early relationships? In the video you're about to watch, you will hear Dr. Alan Srofe discuss one way researchers have come to understand and learn about the quality of parent-child relationships. You just finished watching Dr. Srofe discuss the use of the strain situation in research, and although this doesn't have any application in real-world settings, it is a highly reliable and valid measure of early relationship quality that's used in research. The strain situation has been a critical tool for helping us understand how to support early relationships between parents and children, and have given us a way to quantify the quality of the relationship, which has allowed us to do research and to understand more about why these relationships are so important for children's development.
But how does this actually work? In other words, how do early relationships impact our minds as they grow? This happens in 2 ways. And the first way is that early relationships impact the content of what is in our minds. Examples of this would be things that we know, things that we think, things that we believe, and things that we learn and that we're aware that we learn. This can include anything from how to ride a bike, to what it means to be part of a particular social group, to the values that we have. If the first way that early relationships impact our minds is in the content of our minds, the second is in the container of our minds, and that would be our brains. The input that we get with early experience actually shapes the structure, the biological and physical structure of our brains. And the reason for this is that we are born with brains that develop in a use-dependent, which means kind of a use-it-or-lose-it way. This can be very, very positive, and is how we develop musical talent, other skills, which we don't even think about later in life. But unfortunately, there's a flip side. For example, if a baby is in a relationship that is constantly stressed, or an environment which is very, very stressful, the amygdala, or the brainstem, in the back of their brain, which is responsible for the fight, flight, or freeze response, will be in use way too often, and stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline will be flooding the brain. This is called toxic stress, and it has a wide range of very, very negative impacts on development. One of them, however, is that the cortex, which is in the front of the brain and is used to develop higher order thinking, concrete reasoning, and problem solving, will actually not grow to be as big. That is because our brains are smart, and they have learned that if we are in a fight or flight situation, what we need to be focusing on is surviving and not thinking. So if you look at CAT scans or PET scans of adults who had a lot of toxic stress in their early life, we'll find that the front parts of their brain, their cortex, and around the sides of their brain will actually be physically smaller. It's time for our next writing reflection. So, given the use-dependent nature of the brain that we just talked about, this use it or lose it, and also the impact of toxic stress, reflect a little bit, write a little bit on possible implications on the infant brain development by the following stressors. One is parental depression. Parents who are very flat in their emotions, who have very little energy, and who are struggling just to make it through every day. The second is physical or emotional abuse of the infant themselves. And the third one, which is one very familiar to many of us, is think about the impact of entering into foster care on the developing brain of the infant. Unfortunately, as we know, babies that experience the toxic stress that we've been talking about as their brains develop grow up to be adults and have babies themselves. And there are many reasons for the intergenerational transmission of abuse and trauma, but one of them is actually neurobiological, and it's worth mentioning during this presentation. The neurobiological and the brain structure impact of a parent's past and their own struggles can have a huge impact on their current parent-child relationship. For example, parents often have a hard time regulating and managing their emotions because they do not have the internal or biological equipment to do that very well. On an emotional level, they can be frequently flooded out by triggers or even pre-verbal memories. Something that we see a lot of are parents who, through no malicious intent, have what we would call faulty alarm systems, who do not become distressed or worried or see things as a risk that we ourselves as professionals do. Sometimes it's lack of information or education that's a cause of this, but often it has to do with the parent's own brain structure and their ability to be alarmed or to feel that stress in a healthy and appropriate way. All of that can be a little bit daunting to think about, but the good news is that there is hope. Intervening in the parent-child relationship is the most powerful tool that we have to create positive developmental outcomes, not just for the babies, but for the parents themselves. It is possible to change and impact the brain development, not just of the child, but of the adults around them. Sounds like a big task, so how do we do this? Well, we do it in 3 ways. The first 2 might be 2 that most of us are pretty familiar with. The first is teaching. Teaching is about telling parents and caregivers what we would like them to do and giving them information about how to do it. This could be parenting skills or it could be developmental information. The second is modeling. If teaching is talking to parents about what to do, modeling is actually doing it ourselves in the presence of the parent, in the hopes that they'll be able to copy us or they'll have that experience of seeing what that skill is like in action, and then we'll be able to do it themselves. Both of these use higher order thinking and the cortex in the brain. Parallel process is the last way that we help parents, and it is really profoundly powerful. So what is parallel process? Parallel process we can do throughout our work with a family, and what it means is that we are providing parents and caregivers with the same kind of relationship-based support that's thoughtful, in tune, supportive, and empathic that we want them to provide for their kids. We are not targeting the parent's thinking brain, we are targeting their feeling brain. We're helping them by providing them with a relationship with us. We are allowing their brains to continue to make new connections that help them to be more regulated, more aware, and will help them then turn around and provide the same level of awareness for their kids. Parallel process is not something that we necessarily need to talk about with the parent. It's something that just lives within the relationship. Here are two of my favorite quotes about parallel process. You can't give, as a parent, what you've never received. The second is by Jeree Paul, one of the founding mothers of infant mental health. This is her platinum rule, and it says, "Do unto others as you would have others do unto others." These are good words. So we've talked quite a bit about infants, and we've talked even more about caregivers and the caregiver-infant relationship. It'd be worth your time to spend just a moment talking about ourselves and reflective functioning. What is reflective functioning? I would define it as self-awareness, being aware of our own skills, our values, our thinking, but most importantly, of the many, many responses that can come up within us when we're working with these very distressed children and families. We want to be paying attention to this for a few reasons. One is because it helps us be more targeted and more thoughtful in our intervention in the relationship between the parent and the baby. It helps us to sort out, in other words, what are our issues, our own triggers, our own ideas, and what are those of the parent. Our own responses can also be very helpful information. If we are feeling overwhelmed or irritable, it's quite likely that the parent is as well. We can use that non-verbal emotional information to add to and augment the work that we do. Reflective functioning is not like a light switch that you turned on. It's something which needs to be developed and that we need our own professional support, whether it be formal supervision, colleagues, other peer support, ongoing training. Any number of things can help us tend to this very critical, important part of infant mental health work. So we know that families' needs are very, very complex. And in order to wrap around these families that we serve and to think in a flexible way about both the parent and the baby, we need to move flexibly ourselves in the way that we deliver services to them. As we know, most of the intervention that we do with families is kind of a patchwork. Different providers can give families different things. Although I will say that in this day and age, quite often as providers, we find ourselves providing a number of services, even some that we were not intended to, simply because there are no other resources. So let's go over the 6 major categories of infant mental health service, and then you'll have a chance to reflect on them at the end. The first group of services are what I call nuts and bolts. The first is concrete assistance, which includes basic needs, food, shelter, medicine, housing, and those sorts of things. In addition, as part of concrete assistance, we often find ourselves helping families to navigate and enroll in systems which will get those basic needs met. This can mean anything from connecting with their local school district to get an IFSP, accessing benefits, or applying for SSI. The second is advocacy. If concrete assistance are helping families navigate systems, advocacy is kind of the opposite. It's helping these systems that are in place accommodate the individual needs of families. We might do this in any number of ways. Writing letters of support for eligibility for services, making personalized referrals, and just doing our part to help systems meet families' needs. The second group of services are developmental and relational, and there are 4 of them. Because of the critical nature of those early parent-child relationships or caregiver-child relationships, we are constantly assessing and supporting them. Assessment is not something that happens at the beginning of treatment or intervention. It's something which is ongoing. We are looking for the strengths, which may change over time, and we're looking for vulnerabilities, which may change over time. The next is emotional support. Even in the most well-resourced and typical family, quite honestly, having a baby can be a disorganizing and even traumatic experience. Suddenly, families find themselves sleep-deprived, struggling with no free time, sometimes struggling with basic needs, and also struggling to meet the ever-changing developmental needs of an infant. Part of our job is to validate and support parents' experiences as they go through this very difficult time. Something that really connects with emotional support is the next service, which is developmental guidance. Not only are we providing much needed and sometimes much appreciated information for parents about developmental stages that their young child might be going through, we're also anticipating with them what might be challenging or what might be coming next. The last service is parent-infant psychotherapy, and this is where the mental health professional does come in. Parent-infant psychotherapy is frequently an element of infant mental health which comes into play when the relationship between the infant and the parent is particularly challenging or stressed. What makes parent-infant psychotherapy different from more traditional individual psychotherapy is that it is almost always provided with the parent and the baby together in the room. In parent-infant psychotherapy, special attention is paid to the parent's past, their past experiences as a child, their own needs, their expectations, sometimes their trauma, and this parallel process that we've outlined in some of our earlier slides. Parent-infant psychotherapy has the opportunity to hone in on it in a much more focused and therapeutic clinical way. Well, we've come to the end of the presentation, but before we stop, let's do a final writing reflection. Take a minute and go through the last couple of slides about the range of infant mental health services and think for a moment, which of these services do you feel that you currently provide? And for those that you don't, do you feel like you have trusted colleagues or names within the community where you could refer families? And my last question is this. As you go back over this presentation, which of the outlined principles and elements of infant mental health are you curious about? Which are ones that you find yourself using quite a bit now in your current work? Where would you like to get more support and training? I really want to thank you for taking the time to reflect, learn, read, and write with me today. And at the end of the presentation is a brief bibliography with a few resources. I strongly encourage you to keep exploring the world of infant mental health.